OG Rose here, and today we're going to be talking about a paper called On Thinking and Perceiving. And one of the key ideas for getting the paper is one, to understand that we have this tendency to conflate everything the brain does as thinking, when really the brain has different processes. It's not the case that everything that enters my consciousness is a expression of thought. I think it's very important that we also have a different category that I'm just going to call perception. If I am looking at a bookcase and I am thinking about the bookcase, then my thought and my perception blur. They kind of blend, and it's like two rivers join and become one. So it's very easy to kind of go, oh, I'm just thinking about the bookcase. But if I look at a bookcase and I think about my grandmother, then I am perceiving the bookcase while thinking about my grandmother. And so there's two different mental acts going on. I could say, oh, well, how do you know the thought, my subjectivity of the bookcase is accurate? But I would argue the very fact that you have the ability to sort of split your subjectivity and thinking away from your experience of the bookcase would give you reason to think that the bookcase is actually there. And a lot of times what we go through life is we're constantly trying to translate into rational or thoughtful terms what we perceive. Or if we're like imagining a plot to a novel, we're trying to translate what we think into something we can perceive, into a physical object of a book. And also I think it's very important because the very fact that I can perceive a bookcase but then think about my grandmother would be evidence that I'm not simply a product of causal forces, because if I was, then when I perceive the bookcase, I should think about the bookcase. But the very fact that I can kind of split my thinking of perception would give me reason to think that there's something, that I'm not merely a product of causation, that I have some ability to cause myself, and so there'd be evidence of freedom. And there's also kind of a sense, too, in which when I perceive and think about the bookcase, it's going to seem like it's going to seem like there's no such thing as the mind independent of the brain, or that thought and perception are distinct because they're blurred. But it's in these acts. It's kind of in these acts, almost like Heidegger talks about a doorknob being something you notice when it breaks. It's likewise in these moments when you break thinking away from perception that you get evidence that mind is there. But then, of course, the moment you start thinking about the mind, you can't perceive it, and so it kind of vanishes. It's like it's not there. I also think there's a way in which the majority of and also if I perceive the bookcase without thinking about it, there's a sense in which I have a brain but not a mind. If and when I'm looking at the bookcase and thinking about my grandmother, there's a sense in which I have a mind relative to the thought of my grandmother, and only a brain relative to the perception of the bookcase. And I also think, too, a lot of times when you get into sort of like Heidegger talking about transcending being into uppercase B being, or sort of Buddhism about escaping the attachments of phenomenon in the world, I think a lot of what they're describing is an effort to transcend thought into perception, or to try to create a new kind of thought of which entails perception and kind of encapsulates it, which of course is an impossibility, because no thought can equal a perception. Even though perceptions inspire thoughts. So anyway, the paper gets into a lot more, but it's just really important to understand that not everything your brain does is something you can call thinking. And it's also important to realize that, because if we tend to ask the question, well, how do I know what I think is reliable? Well, you don't, but that's a different question from asking, how do I know my perception is reliable? The problem of subjectivity versus objectivity is something that's more present when it comes to thinking. And of course, I can have incomplete perception. We know that there are certain animals that can perceive sound and colors and things differently from human beings, so we have reason to believe that my perception is incomplete. But that's very different from saying my perception is unreliable. And so I think we also have to make distinctions between incompleteness and unreliability. If I've never perceived a bookcase turning into a dolphin, then I have reason to think that bookcases do not become dolphins. Again, to repeat that thought of Karl Popper that permeates throughout a lot of the works of O.G. Rose. And also, too, there are other things, like where you can think that an artist is someone who perceives something and then they're trying to translate it into words or pictures, which is something they have to think about to make. So it's this interesting act of trying to translate a perception into a thought back into a perception. Or sometimes an artist has an idea that then they're trying to translate into a sculpture, something you perceive. So we as human beings often exist in this space between thought and perception. But in not having that distinction, we just kind of conflate it all as thought, and I think that contributes to some confusion. So anyway, the paper is called On Thinking and Perceiving. You can find it at ogrose.com, and thank you for your time.